Nowadays, almost everyone has a pet, but some people just can't stand any kind and do horrible things to them. Today, you will see the bizarre story of one of these people. And today, you will see two of the most disturbing stories on the internet. But first, if you're new here, remember to subscribe to the channel. The channel's goal is to get 1,000 subscribers by the end of the year, and I think we can achieve it. So please sign up. Now let's move on to the first story. I hate my friend's pet. This is why. I recently realized that the older I get, the fewer close friends I keep. I get so caught up in things in the real world that I end up forgetting about the people who have made monumental impacts on my life. This harsh reality hit me when one of my closest friends, who I hadn't spoken to in a while, messaged our group chat with the devastating news that he was terminally ill. The impact of just a few text messages hit me like a grenade in a 10x10 room, as the wave of "I love you" and "we need to see each other soon" invaded the chat. I stood there, reading the message over and over again. My mind traveled through all the memories I shared with this person and how, in an instant, all the memories we had left to make were taken from us. Not just at that moment, but in so many others. I prioritized things that, in the end, were not as important as the significant people in my life. It was a shocking realization. Needless to say, not only did I make plans to see this friend and give him all the support and love I could, I also took 2 weeks off to go on a little road trip and reconnect with many of the people I was starting to connect with. Lose contact. For everyone out there, I highly recommend you do the same. Please reach out to the people you have cared about for so many years. You never know when the last time will be. If you can, keep those meaningful connections alive. Anyway, the trip turned out to be really great. Not only did I get to see a lot of the country I hadn't yet seen, but re-establishing those old connections made me feel more complete. On my way back, I only had one other person to visit, and it was probably the person I had the strongest connection with. I don't want to put his real name here, so I'll call him Jacob. Jacob and I have known each other since elementary school and were inseparable until I went to college. When I told him about my trip and that his house was the one I was most excited to visit, the feeling was clearly mutual. He recently moved back to his childhood home after losing his apartment, and as childish as it sounds, I was excited to be in the same rooms we used to play in when we were children. When I arrived at his house, I saw him sitting outside smoking something with a familiar aroma. I greeted him with a loud, "What's up, brother?" He returned a warm smile and we hugged. We start talking like only childhood friends can, ranging from boring topics to politics and strange things in a way that only those closest to you can understand. When we finally entered, a distinctly older version of his family greeted me with a fully cooked, home-cooked meal. The love that radiated from them hadn't lost its rhythm from years ago. I'm not sure which part of the brain is responsible for the nostalgia, but that little bit lit up like a Christmas tree as we all sat down to eat and talked about the years that had passed. Everything was exactly the way I remembered it. In an oddly personal moment, Jacob's mother commented on how perfect the timing of my visit was. When I asked why, she revealed that Jacob had been struggling since losing his apartment and his longtime girlfriend, and that this was preventing him from holding down a steady job. I wanted to tell her that maybe this wasn't the best time to discuss this, but Jacob seemed to agree, giving me a soft nod when I awkwardly replied, "Yeah, man, I'm here for you." Half out of necessity and half because the conversation was getting a little uncomfortable, I excused myself to use the bathroom, which was located just beyond Jacob's old room. That's when I discovered the first thing that seemed shockingly different. A quick glance at the unusually clean room revealed that taking up almost all the space on a table next to his bed was a large white cage. My first instinct was confusion. My friend, who had always been disorganized, now kept a spotlessly clean room, and this same person who had a huge fear of rodents now had a chubby brown rat in a cage. And when I say standing, I mean he was literally standing on two disturbingly humanoid legs, his arms casually hanging at his sides, looking straight at me. He didn't move his body as I approached, but the slightest movement of his head, with his dark eyes fixed on me, let me know I was being watched. Strangely, the fact that this creature was looking directly into my soul wasn't what disturbed me most. What really got me was the ringing in my ears the longer I maintained eye contact. It filled me with an incredible sense of sadness, and the only way to get rid of it was to completely turn away. I closed my eyes and ran out of the room, only turning around when I heard what sounded like a small door slamming behind me, and found an empty cage where the mouse used to be. When I finally returned to the dinner table, Jacob immediately shouted how long I'd been gone and noticed the beads of sweat forming on my forehead. Perplexed, I looked into Jacob's eyes and asked when he had become a clean freak, overcome his fear of rodents, acquired a pet rat, and even taught that rat to stand on 2 legs and stare at whoever passed by. His response was, I don't even know how to explain it. Did he kind of laugh at me? Or maybe he was laughing at the situation. I don't know for sure. The point is that he replied, yeah, Mr. Katz is an interesting character, isn't he? Sorry, what? I thought he hadn't heard me right or thought I was joking, so I reiterated my experience. He nodded and said he totally understood me. As strange as it was, I decided to let it go. I couldn't rationalize it at the time, but honestly, I'm not an expert on rats. Maybe it's a normal thing for them to do every now and then. Maybe Jacob just really likes messing with people now, and teaching his pet to stand and face is a great way to do that. As scary as the mouse was, he was still just a mouse. After dinner, Jacob and I went for a mini hike, grabbed some snacks, and visited some of our old haunts. After a few hours of socializing, that warm feeling of nostalgia and happiness began to fill me again, so much so that I had almost forgotten about the scary mouse. During our walks around the city, I noticed Jacob taking a few seconds to absorb the things around him. I've always admired Jacob's ability to appreciate the moment and put it into perspective in a positive way. He was always great at putting things into context and grounding us no matter the situation. But this time he looked different, as if looking at the past makes you afraid of the future. After finishing school, finding someone he thought he was in love with, and getting a new job and apartment, things seemed to be getting better, until they didn't, and he ended up right back where he started. I could see the frustration building in him as he looked at me, his best friend, seeing all of our memories as just that, memories. A past life. While for him it was just his everyday existence, same thing as always. When I realized that being there wasn't as much fun for Jacob as it was for me, I suggested we go back to his house and relax for a bit before I left. When we got back, things took another strange turn. All the cars in front of the garage were still there. No one had mentioned leaving before. In fact, Jacob's parents and siblings even made reference to seeing us later. However, the house was completely empty and silent. I asked Jacob where his family had gone. I went to the rooms, bathroom, backyard, nothing. Again, he laughed and made an odd comment about how they were probably improving themselves somewhere. Taking that moment to silently nod my head and move on, I thought I'd end the night with a silly movie and a few scenes before heading back to the hotel. 2 shots of whiskey and a half Eric Andre's special later, Jacob casually turns to me and murmurs, I knew he was going to get sick, before he even told us. The world stopped for a moment. I turned to Jacob, dumbfounded, and replied, stumbling over my words, What? Who? He gave me a blank look before picking up his phone, scrolling down to a text conversation he was having with himself, and showing me a message detailing exactly what our mutual friend told us. And to make matters worse, he had sent this to himself a week earlier. I didn't know how or why this was happening. And before I could ask if Jacob had simply been informed before the rest of us, he showed me another message, this time about me, sent that same day. In it said how I had planned a 2-week trip after hearing the news, how I had gone to see Jacob on the last part of my journey, and the exact day and time I would be there. Before he could go any further, I knocked the phone out of his hand and told him to stop. If this trip was an elaborate prank, then fine, but he could at least have the decency to leave our friend out of this weird joke. Jacob shook his head and told me I didn't understand. It wasn't a joke. I wanted to leave right then, but I felt frozen. What did he mean? Before Jacob could explain further, I heard my name being called from the slightly obscure door leading to the garage. It sounded like Jacob's mother's voice. A wave of relief washed over me. I had completely forgotten that the family had a driveway and had converted it into a secondary living room. Whatever was going on with Jacob, he wasn't okay. And at the very least, I felt the need to tell his parents that he needed help. With a simple, "Yes, give me a second," I jumped off the couch and ran towards the garage with Jacob staring at me the whole time. Blindly, I opened the door and started to say something disorganized about how something was wrong, but I was greeted with a meaty hand over my mouth, an arm around my abdomen, and a deafening. Jacob's parents and 2 brothers stood in a nearly empty garage, fixated on the one thing I hoped never to see again. A table with a large white cage containing a model house and a chubby brown mouse standing in front of it. I was being held in place by Jacob's huge father. All I could do was cast my eyes to the young woman closest to the table, muttering under her breath desperately, "Come on, do something, please." Mr. Katz, however, didn't seem to care about the girl. His black, soulless eyes, which seemed a little too big for his skull, were fixed directly on me. As much as I didn't want to, I couldn't help but look back. Something deep inside me wanted to watch what he would do. And when I got my answer, a sense of confusion enveloped me. Where before the chubby mouse seemed motionless, He now began to sway rhythmically back and forth. I watched as the rat moved its body like a pendulum, and my body began to go numb with each swing. As the world became more and more confusing, a distinct humming noise grew louder and louder, but this time it was different. This time the buzzing was accompanied by a voice, perhaps the most comforting voice I've ever heard, a voice that told me everything would be okay, that Mr. Katz only wanted the best for me, and that I should be grateful to be in his presence. I was in a safe home after all, surrounded by people who loved me. I had experienced great memories, and for all the uncertainty, Mr. Katz seemed like a big rat after all, a mouse that should be respected and loved, revered even. That's why he had such a big house in his cage. Maybe he deserved an even bigger one. And who knows? In return, he would give me something, knowledge. What could be greater than that? In the blink of an eye, that angelic embrace was sucked away, and what replaced it was pure terror. Images of horrors that I could never imagine were etched in my memory. Deeply dark revelations about loved ones and strangers alike flowed through my mind. Evil secrets about the things we question daily have become harsh, inescapable truths. I saw crimes yet to be committed, mass events that would impact thousands of innocent people, and the relentless wave of sadness that accompanied the seemingly harmless actions of our daily existence, and the inescapable knowledge of where our choices were taking us. I tried to distract myself, but with each failed attempt, something 10 times more horrible invaded my mind. A panic attack reached a fever pitch, but I wasn't getting the sweet relief of stress-induced numbness. I was teetering on the precipice of deepest despair, anxiety, and depression as the thoughts piled up over and over again. Anguish, suffering, and a horrible fate crashed against me like waves on a rocky beach. Each impact sent shockwaves through me until finally it stopped. The next thing I remember is being on the floor, looking at Mr. Katz. I wiped the saliva from my mouth and tried to adjust my eyes to focus on the demonic rodent that had now left its cage and was in the small space on the table. He looked at me with those 2 black voids he had for eyes and started gnawing on the still twitching body of a very large cockroach. His yellowed teeth methodically chewed the sticky remains while his meaty tail twitched behind him. I expected another round of excruciating mind games, but another voice came from behind me. "Do you want to pray to Mr. Katz now?" she said. To my surprise, next to the door, Jacob smiled broadly at me. "You're my closest friend, Shakur. You are the only person outside of my family with whom I could share this gift. Don't you want to know which of our friends is getting married? Who will succeed and who will fail? Or when they go to die? He also tells you things about yourself, you know. How to be a better person." I yelled at him to shut up, and instinctively he shut up. Despite my outburst, everyone else still had their eyes fixed on the damn rat on the table. Everyone except Jacob, who took another step towards me and said that the choice really was mine. But in all his years, no one had ever said no to Mr. Katz. In Jacob's words, "Knowledge this great is too valuable to pass up. You never know what you'll learn." As I slowly stood up, my mind was in a whirl. It took me a moment to process what had just happened. After briefly evaluating my choice, I concluded that I had never been so sure of something in my life. I didn't know what the hell that thing was, but I was pretty sure it wasn't what they thought it was. And I knew one thing, whatever it was something I didn't want to anger. Carefully, I walked over to Jacob and held out my right hand. He looked at her and smiled at me. When he went to press, I threw a crooked left hook to his chin. I'm not exactly Mike Tyson, but it was enough to stun him, which allowed me to push him down and run back into the house and out the front door. I did what you should never do and looked back, only to see Jacob's parents running after me. After a brief stumble, I managed to open the front door and throw myself into the car. I fumbled in my pocket for the keys and barely managed to put them in the ignition as they attacked the windows. But luckily, I was quick enough to hit the gas and speed off into the night with no specific direction. Only when I was sure I was far enough away from them did I finally pull into a random parking lot and try to process everything that had happened before heading back to the hotel. I admit that I also stopped at a 24-hour gas station, bought an irresponsible amount of alcohol, and found a pizzeria open late. I ate until I couldn't take it anymore, passed out, and woke up hours later with no idea how much time had passed. I had planned to stay in the city for a few more days, but after that, I think I'll go straight home. I'm using my last day here to write this while the details are still fresh. Part of me does this as a form of therapy, a less expensive catharsis. Another part because I'm still in shock, and I had to reread my own story several times to accept what happened, and partly because I know Jacob will try to contact me. As bad as what happened was, Jacob, I love you, man. I don't know how this all started or why you need this thing in your life to show you horrible futures, but please seek help. These days, there are so many resources to help you heal. But until then, or until this thing is completely dead, we can't see each other. We can't communicate, nothing. What happened in your house is what happens when humans venture into the darkest corners of the earth, places we should never explore, and I'm sorry that corner trapped you. I wish I could be there for you, which might make me a bad person, but I can't. I've seen so many horrible things, terrible things about people I love or loved, things I might have to go to the police about, futures that I have to consider, decide whether to tell or let happen. It's not fair, none of that is. And I wish I had the answers, but I don't. Until this is resolved, and who knows if it ever will be, this has to be goodbye. I needed to bury my dog, but I had a scary reason for it. I buried my dog last month, at least I think it was. There was so little left of him, and his once rich golden coat was so faded and yellowed that empty, sickly canine body barely looked like the same happy, energetic companion that used to chase cars in the neighborhood. He was the same one who was looking for that little red ball so excitedly, who loyally accompanied me to the park, helping to display his cuteness as my girl magnet. I called him Loki because of his pointy ears that resembled the classic helmet of the Marvel incarnation, and because he always seemed to have a knowing smile, typical of the god of mischief. I didn't choose the name thinking about the hell that your death would bring me, or that he would become my own personal Jormungandr. That morning, I woke up with a strange, undefined feeling of dread. What brought me out of the gray and disturbing dreams was the sound of silence. There was no Loki's happy bark, no hungry scratching at the door, and I didn't hear the patter of his little paws on the floor. I intuitively felt that something was wrong. There was a draft in the house, and when I went downstairs, I found the front door open. I cursed in disbelief. I always locked the door, but somehow it was open, and the dog was out. Imagine my shock when I stepped onto my front lawn looking for my missing dog and found that emaciated, discolored corpse waiting for me. My throat sank into my stomach as I looked at that piece that died of meat sickness, who was once my best friend. I turned pale with shock, my skin tight and cold, and my jaw dropped. I didn't even realize that I was standing barefoot in the last place where he had relieved himself. He was not only shocked, but also perplexed. He wasn't sick. There were no visible injuries. How did this happen? What killed him? My cousin Ivor is a veterinarian. I was devastated by the death of Loki and disturbed by the mystery that surrounded her. A rational mind could tell me there was nothing supernatural or strange about it. Maybe he had an undetected brain tumor or had eaten something he shouldn't have. Ivor was empathetic and offered to perform an autopsy, hoping to appease my curiosity. Using a shovel, even carefully, to pick up my friend and place him in a black trash bag seemed so inglorious and disrespectful. As I drove to my cousin's clinic, I felt that no explanation would be enough. No combination of words and condolences would fill the gap in my life and the hole in my heart. The autopsy took a few hours. Ivor told me that the results would take a few weeks, and he seemed disturbed by what he had already seen. I didn't ask any questions, and he handed me my best friend in a small, unmarked box. I buried him in the backyard and resigned myself to a life without Loki. People deal with grief in different ways, and I think we react differently to different types of grief. Death. When my mother committed, I completely lost my appetite, and the food I forced down my throat tasted like ash. But in the days and weeks after the death of Loki, I was overcome by a strange, insatiable hunger. Naturally, I assumed it was a coping mechanism and wondered if I would be back to normal when I received the autopsy results. Closure is such a strange human concept, and I wonder if any of us actually find it in this life. The strange thing was that no matter how much I ate, I could never completely satisfy my hunger. My friends were shocked and worried about my weight loss. They knew about my dog and assumed I was losing weight out of sadness. I didn't alarm them, avoiding sharing my disturbing fantasy that it wasn't just my mouth that demanded sustenance. I felt like I had 1,000 appetites inside me, all crying out for more, something that could never be satisfied or questioned. I started eating things I had never eaten before. I had always thought escargot was disgusting, but now I devoured plate after plate of snails, craving them in the middle of the night. Part of me even wanted to try them raw. I couldn't even taste the slimy, mushy taste. There was no longer any pleasure in eating. I just knew I needed to eat. In fact, I continued to lose weight. I spent my days indoors with the curtains closed, avoiding the sun and ignoring the phone while it rang until my friends left messages that I deleted without listening. Sleep took a long time to come and was always disturbed by disturbing dreams that I forgot when I woke up. Sometimes I would be awakened by the rumbling of my empty stomach, which demanded that I go to the kitchen to get something. A A bowl of cottage cheese, a week-old pizza in the freezer, that bruised apple about to go bad, or yes, more of those horrible snails. It didn't matter. Nothing tasted like anything, and nothing could satisfy me. My bowel movements were long and painful. I blushed instantly, not wanting to see if there was blood in my feces. My skin was pale and pasty, with deep circles under my eyes, and I barely recognized the face staring back at me in the mirror. I was falling apart. I didn't want to go to the doctor. Nothing they could tell me would be comforting, and there was no cure for, whatever this was. There was something new in me, but what I initially thought was a gap in my life no longer felt accurate. It was filled unmistakably with something. That thought, a question as unanswerable as hunger, kept me awake at night. Had I gotten it from Loki? Was it death or something worse? In life, there are questions we simply don't want answered. Last night I got mine, and now I don't know if I'll be able to sleep again. I woke up with terrible pain, something I had never felt before and couldn't understand. When I sat down, I found blood on the sheets, a red oozing stain, but no sign of injury. It was then that, with horror, I realized that the blood was coming from my back. My breath caught in my throat as reality, still completely incomprehensible, enveloped me. There was so much blood that I felt weak and exhausted. I don't know if I still had tears inside me, so I just howled, overcome by the injustice, the pain, and the meaninglessness of it all. My desperate sobs were interrupted by the ringing of the phone next to my bed. It was Ivor, of course, practically the only number I still answered. He normally wouldn't call so late, but he knew I was hurting, just waiting for an answer. If he had known that I was not only awaiting the results of my dog's autopsy, but also being consumed by something indescribable, he would have spoken with more alarm and caution. If I had known what he was about to tell me, I wouldn't have answered the phone. "I know it's late," my cousin said tiredly, "but I got the results." He paused before continuing. "Would you prefer if I called tomorrow and we could talk about this?" "No," I responded quickly, perhaps louder than I should have. I took a deep breath, trying to calm down. "I'm sorry, I just want to know now, please." "Yes," he replied gently, having no idea what I was going through. He hadn't seen me since the day I left my dog with him. It turns out Loki had parasites. Parasites? I choked, letting that horrible word roll off my tongue as I tried to assimilate it. "Have you traveled to Indonesia recently?" he asked, curious, more than just out of scientific interest. Indonesia? The question confused and irritated me. What was he talking about? "Taenia," he announced. "Indonesian tapeworm. I knew they were worms, but I had to send them for analysis to identify this species. It's very rare, almost extinct in the wild." He looked uneasy. "Normally, it is only found in the intestines of orangutans." "Orangutans," I repeated mechanically, rubbing the bridge of my nose. "Almost extinct. God knows how that got into your dog." "So, that's, I held my breath as I tried to organize my thoughts. "That's bad, right?" "There haven't been many studies," he admitted. "But it seems to be the kind of thing that drains the host. It spreads from the intestine to other parts of the body. It reproduces internally, attaches itself to the digestive system, growing and growing as the body it's in shrinks and weakens. They even enter the brain, adjusting the host's behavior so that it eats what they want. They stay until there is nothing left but a dry, empty shell." A shiver came over me. I could barely formulate the next question, but I needed to know. How? I hesitated. "How do they spread? Do you have to eat the host or something?" "That's one way, or you can step in the host's feces. That's where they lay their eggs." So that was it. I had completely forgotten about this detail, something that at the time seemed like just a minor inconvenience on an already tragic day. I was more concerned about giving my dog a decent rest than washing his feet. Now I knew that simple oversight, which I had erased from my memory as soon as I cleaned myself up, had doomed me. I dropped the phone without thanking my cousin or saying goodbye. It was beyond such pleasantries now. I didn't even care that the screen cracked on the wooden floor. None of that mattered anymore. I wanted to remove myself from this filthy world. I wanted to be alone, but I wasn't. As soon as the phone fell, I was overcome by a sharp, searing pain in my back. It was as if something was touching me inside, as if my insides were on fire. I ran to the bathroom, even though I knew it was useless to try to drain this evil from me. I sat there for hours, sobbing, waiting for some relief that would never come. So I listened, a faint sound coming from inside me. It started as a strange hiss, like escaping steam, and then he started talking. "He's right, you know," a strange, high-pitched, inhuman voice said from inside me. "We're inside you and we're not going anywhere. We like it here, crawling around, eating what you eat, draining you inside, making our home here. We're not just in your intestines. We are everywhere. We'll be in your brain soon. You will no longer be able to think for yourself. You will just be a vessel. It will wither away as we grow stronger and multiply. Then I felt something move inside me. I jumped in fright and felt profound disgust when I looked in the mirror and saw the king worm, thin and slimy, poking my skin as if it was taunting me. I'll never forget his beady little eyes or his sharp fangs as he smiled and told me, "Then eat plenty," before retreating into my bowels. I don't know how much time I have left. I don't care anymore. My thoughts are getting confused. All I do now in these last days of mine is eat and eat, feeding the monsters inside me. It won't take long. When they invade my brain, I hope they make me accept it. I am their slave, but perhaps my horror turns to complacency as I am eaten alive from within. They'll leave me an empty shell, just like my dog, if that was still him. Until then, I'm in hell, where the worm does not die. I discovered the curse of the bear paw. I never understood why my father brought it home with him. At the time, I was about to start college, and the week before my 7-hour drive to Maine, my dad went on a hike in one of our state parks. When I was a child, I used to go with him, but at that stage of life, I didn't have the time or inclination to spend an entire weekend in the forest, especially before I uprooted myself and moved on to a new phase. I clearly remember him walking through the front door that Monday. He had an obvious sunburn and a huge smile on his face. Maybe because he knew it would scare Mom, or maybe because of the fascination of what he had found. But when we greeted him, he reached out and showed a Ziploc plastic bag. Inside, there was a small collection of bones. Mom screamed and immediately started cursing him for bringing a biohazard into the house. He winked at me as he tried to calm her down and asked me, "Do you know what this is, son?" I shook my head, kind of not understanding the from him. I was about to go to physical therapy school, and I think he thought I would share his enthusiasm. "This is a genuine fossilized bear paw," he said, waving the bag at me. I picked up the bag carefully, holding it by the corners with my fingertips. It looked more or less what I expected, but it wasn't complete. There were 3 small digits attached to what would be the base of the paw. The bear didn't look very old. Its paw was smaller than my hand. It had a unique yellowish color and appeared very porous, with small marks covering its surface. An aura emanated that I can only describe as strange. "How do you know this is from a bear?" I asked. He began to enthusiastically describe all his self-taught knowledge about how the tips of the digits ended in a sharper point, indicating that they had claws, and how the density of the paw corresponded to the weight of a heavy animal. I could see that Mom and I were listening, but without much confidence in what he was saying. He continued, ignoring our exchanged glances, and began to show us some photos he took during the walk. He even made a point of stopping to print the photos before heading home. He showed us the waterfall where he found the duck and the camp he set up. After a few more stories, he finally stopped. We moved on, and he kept the paw in his office, hiding it in the trunk until he could display it somehow. Mom, Dad, my brother, and I tried to enjoy the last few days that I would be home. There was sadness in the air, hanging over us with each passing day, but still, that was the best week of my life with my family. I would give anything to go back to that week and stop my dad from going on that hike. A week later, I drove to Maine, saying a tearful goodbye to them all. I was excited. My future was all in front of me at that moment. I didn't know everything would fall apart. A few months later, I received a call from my father at around 2:30 in the morning. I woke up startled by the phone ringing. Since I lived in a single room, I didn't have to worry about waking up a roommate. My brother was in the hospital. They weren't sure if he would survive. I immediately grabbed my things and jumped in the car. It was a miracle that I got home safely after driving at high speed for almost 7 hours straight. When I arrived at the hospital, I was a wreck from the trip. But even so, I should have been able to recognize my brother. They didn't know what had happened to him, but doctors assumed he was the victim of a hit and run. His face was a mess, completely destroyed. His legs. The doctors said that if he survived the night, they would have to amputate them. It was as if he had fallen several stories, which was simply not possible. My parents woke up to the sound of someone breaking his bedroom window and found him outside on the lawn. He shouldn't have even gone out that night. He was still in his pajamas. He had problems with in the past, so maybe he was trying to catch something or find a dealer. But it was useless to try to understand what could have happened. He took his last breath a few hours later. Mom and Dad were never the same again. We did a service for him soon after. The coffin had to be closed for obvious reasons. I stood in line, receiving condolences from friends and family. Everything was simply more difficult at that moment. My grades started to drop. I became a recluse, locked in my dorm, sleeping all day. I wasn't sure if I could finish college. Mom stopped working, and well, Dad just stopped being the same. He tried to move on. But what do you do when your wife is stuck in endless grief? I managed to finish my first year of college through sheer willpower alone, but I was eager to return home for the summer. However, any hope I had of finding comfort at home quickly dissipated. Home was different. The silence was palpable. The absence of one person made everything more empty, and even though our house wasn't very big, it felt huge and desolate. Mom spent her days locked in her room, and Dad was always away, at work or involved in some new hobby he picked up each week. I felt frustrated with him for giving up on Mom the way he did, but after a few weeks at home, I started to understand. The heart of our family seemed to be gone, just like the person who took my brother's life. We stopped waiting for answers and could only try to deal with the pieces that were left. Then the nightmares started. At first they were simple. I could smell the trees around me and remember vague flashes of the environment. I didn't lose much sleep until the dreams started to take shape. I woke up with my heart racing and sweat soaking my clothes, to the point of making the sheets wet. I couldn't tell if I was screaming in my dream or in reality. I would wake up feeling tied to the bed, unable to move. There was immense pressure on me, making even breathing difficult, as if I didn't tell my family any of this. Mom would ignore me, and Dad, well, a camping trip wouldn't solve anything. I ended up dropping out of school before the start of my second year. I couldn't commit to living hours away, and my dad clearly needed help paying the bills. Mom was slowly wasting away, spending her days in her room looking out the window. I tried to convince my dad to call someone or do something, but he had his own problems. Most of the time he was out somewhere. It said I was camping, but every time I looked in the garage, the tent and camping gear were still there. I started to assume he had a mistress or something. A son shouldn't see his father that way. Things only got worse that summer. Mom disappeared. I called the police and explained that she barely left her room and had no friends. The police were not impressed with the condition of the house. I was working 5 days a week, and on the days I was home, I didn't have the energy or desire to run my parents' house. I had dropped out of school for a year and was numb to the lack of parental care. The police took me to give them some information about my mother, and it was easy to see that they didn't trust what I was saying. I'd be lucky to get 4 hours of sleep a night. I could barely recognize myself. My face was thin and sunken. I felt and looked like a walking skeleton. My father and I were the only suspects, and I couldn't even blame them. My family was a mess, and everything I said only made things worse. I was honestly relieved to spend the night at the police station. I wasn't under arrest, so one of the officers let me lie down on a couch in the back room. It was the best rest I had all year. No nightmares about the forest or just total darkness that lasted until I was woken up by someone shaking my shoulder. They found Mom and took her to the hospital. For some inexplicable reason, she was nearly 15 miles from home and was found face down in a lake. I was taken there, but when I arrived, I'm sure she had nothing to say to me anyway. I can't remember the events that unfolded afterwards. I was in shock. All I wanted was to stop existing. Dad was still nowhere to be found, and now the police were looking for him. I didn't know what to live anymore. I was trying hard to keep a roof over our heads. I gave up on my dreams, on my future. All for what? To keep my mother's medical bills dead? I was lucky that some distant cousin offered to take care of the funeral, but I was broke. When I returned home, it was early in the morning. The sun was just starting to rise. I stood at the front door for God knows how long. My mind was blank. My stomach hurt from the lack of food, and the urge to vomit was constant. For a second, I almost expected my brother to be there. Finally, I entered the house and really saw the state of disrepair it was in. There was rubbish strewn everywhere, cobwebs in every corner. It was a crypt for my family, and I was the only one standing in it. I could barely leave the living room, but I looked in every room. I didn't have the courage to witness the downfall of my family or my life. My feet finally took me to the last room in the house, my father's office. The double doors were still closed from the last time he was there, which was, I don't know how many months now. The golden doorknobs gleamed in the light coming through the curtains in the hallway. It was like looking at the sun. I felt like I couldn't open the door, but before I could doubt it, I quickly pushed the handles and the doors opened. They opened with force, ricocheting against the wall. I felt a huge weight lifted off my shoulders, and I took a deep breath, filling my lungs. But the rancid smell of death burned my nose. If I hadn't felt so bad, I probably would have thrown up right there. I didn't even bother to wrinkle my nose when I entered the room. There was a fine layer of dust on everything, but other than that, it was the cleanest room in the house. I assumed some raccoon or something must have died in the walls or attic. Despite the smell, everything was as I remembered. As I walked through the room, the odor only got worse. I did my best to follow the smell, as horrible as it was. I walked to my father's table, where the stench intensified. It didn't appear to be coming from the ceiling. I knelt down, thinking it was coming from the ground, but I realized it was coming from behind me. I turned around and came across the trunk that belonged to my father. I'm not going to lie, I was terrified. I didn't know what he could have stored there. There was no lock, just a simple latch. I reached out and opened it. The smell stopped immediately. At first, there didn't seem to be anything special, just some old books and photo albums from when I was younger. I picked up an album and started leafing through it, but I soon regretted it. There was a photo from Christmas 2010 where we were all smiling for the camera. My brother looked so young, and my mom was all dressed up even though it was about 8 in the morning. I closed the album as a tear fell onto the page. I continued rummaging through the trunk, finding old bills, birth certificates, and passports. Then I stumbled upon a plastic Ziploc bag, something that was almost forgotten in my memory. I picked it up and stared at what was inside. The bear paw my dad brought home before I went to college. She didn't look like she had aged a day. The bone fragments were still intact. Suddenly, a gust of wind brought the smell of rain. I had no idea where it came from, as the windows were closed. The trees creaked loudly against the force of the wind, and my hair whirled around as if I were trapped in the middle of a tornado. A high-pitched buzz deafened me. I dropped the paw to the floor and covered my ears, but that didn't help. I collapsed to the floor, waiting for the horrible event to end, closing my eyes as if that would hide me from what was happening. Then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped. Picture frames fell to the floor and objects that had been on the table scattered around me. I opened my eyes slowly, afraid of what I might see. Luckily for me, there was nothing. But when I turned around for a brief second, I saw something, someone, standing over me. As soon as I blinked, the bones fell in front of me and the figure disappeared. The putrid stench of decomposition returned once more. I took the bones. The bag they were in was gone, and as he held them, it seemed like they were holding themselves together. I ran out of the office and went straight to the garage. I grabbed my dad's hiking backpack and started filling it with what I would need for my journey. A flashlight, lots of extra batteries, food and drink. I felt like I knew exactly what I had to do. I wrapped the paw, or rather the hand, in a tissue and put it in my backpack. I held my breath as I entered the house one last time and went into the living room where my father had hung the photos he took that day. I took the photo of the waterfall and ran outside. I couldn't stand staying in that place any longer. The drive to the state park only took an hour, but it seemed to pass in mere moments. I hadn't been there since elementary school, but everything looked exactly as I remembered. The waterfall would be a good 10 kilometers from where I parked, so I started walking. I hoped to get there before dark. It was still before noon, so there was a chance. As I walked, I saw no signs of life. There were no other walkers. Not even the birds made any noise. It would have been fine if it weren't for the growing weight in my backpack. With every kilometer, it seemed to get heavier. My breaks became more frequent the longer I walked. I had been sick and tired long enough, so I forced myself to keep going. I would be lucky to get to the waterfall before dark. With about 2 miles left, I started to hear waterfalls in the distance. It was a constant haunting sound that haunted my dreams for months. My clothes were soaked with sweat and my legs hurt. I've never been one to believe in magic or the supernatural. Hell, maybe it was just a coincidence, but deep down I knew the death of my brother, my mother, and my father's declining sanity. It was all connected to the day he took that hand from its resting place. When I finally reached the falls, the sun was quickly disappearing. Gratefully, I dropped my backpack on the ground and took out my hand and the photo my father had taken. I was in the right place, but the waterfalls were bigger than I imagined. The waterfall itself was over 100 feet tall, and the pool where the water fell was deep and wide. When my father was here, there must have been a drought because the water was now much deeper than the photo showed and much colder than I could have imagined. I put the photo back in my backpack and grabbed my flashlight. Even if I wanted to, I couldn't let go of her hand. With just 3 fingers, she was gripping hard enough to leave a bruise, I was sure. I turned on the light and was aimless, thinking about where I should start. I couldn't dive. Not only did I have no gear, but the strong currents would pull me under, and I didn't plan on joining the poor soul I was connected to. I started walking to the base of the waterfalls, looking directly at the white current that crashed against the rock and fogged the air. Soon I started to shake. I looked up and down the rock face, looking for any sign of something. I didn't know exactly what. I tried to imagine where my father had found the mortal remains. I knew there was more to the story, something that explained why this curse was on my family. In the heart of the forest, all I could hear was the sound of water. I stopped on the cliff where I was, looking at the pool in front of me. The bones pulled at my hand, becoming heavy like lead. I barely had time to take a deep breath when my body fell into the water. My muscles tensed. I've never been one for cold water, and with the dark sky, I didn't even realize my eyes were closed until my hands hit slippery rocks. The water stung my eyes when I opened them. My flashlight slipped out of my hand. I pushed myself against the ground and stood. The water reached my after I finished struggling. The flashlight shone brightly at my feet. I took a deep breath and bent down again, opened my eyes once more, and grabbed the light. I almost swallowed water as I choked on my own sigh. Even though the water blurred my vision, I knew exactly what I saw. Hidden from the sky above, I saw the hand, and with it a vague illusion, as if it was reaching out to me. Hidden beneath the sediment, wrapped in roots, plants, and algae, a skeleton of a little girl was asking for help. Finally, years later, those bones had found what they were looking for. I pushed myself to the surface once more and walked to dry land. I sobbed uncontrollably, and in the pauses between the sobs, I began to hear the birds and crickets again. I spent the night in that forest thinking about my family. I fell asleep as soon as I dove into my sleeping bag. At first, I didn't know whether I should leave the mystery of the child sideways, but after hearing the sound of running water in my nightmares for so many months, I realized he deserved to be freed from it too. When I told the police there was a body in the falls, they were hesitant to react, but in time they were able to recover the body. The boy was about 13 years old and had been reported missing 25 years ago. The injuries suggested he fell over the falls, breaking his legs and some ribs. As he didn't know how to swim, he ended up... Oh my goodness, Brian Overhill. His father disappeared the same day, leaving Brian's mother without her husband and son. She told the police that they went hiking and never came back. I never saw my father again. Brian's mother wanted to meet me, the news wanted to interview me, and there was even talk about a documentary about the missing person case. But I would never be able to tell them the truth, that my father brought something dark home and that it took 3 lives in return. I've since sold the house and have done my best to take care of myself, but there are still nights when I feel alone. I don't think this feeling will ever leave me, but for now, I try my best to keep my head above water. I've never seen one child eat your pet before. When I joined the case at 47 County Street, I had no idea what was in store for me. As a social worker, I'm used to dealing with all kinds of difficult situations, from infants up to children mistreating their own parents. But when I got the reports about County Street, I didn't expect much. The first letters that arrived were from a neighbor, reporting loud noises, screams in the middle of the night, and a teenager storming out of the house on a bicycle last winter, shortly after the sound of glass breaking inside the house. It seems that this situation has been going on for a few years. Still, something about the way the policeman arrived on Tuesday, pale as a ghost, asking about the case, should have alerted me, but I didn't notice. There I was in the living room of the Bedford family home on County Street, trying to understand what was happening as the story unfolded before me. Dan, the father of the 3 children, was the first to speak with tears in his eyes. "I'm so happy someone called us. My wife and I would never have the courage to contact anyone about this." I thought that was strange, since most people don't want authorities or social services showing up at their door. "Can I offer you some water, coffee perhaps?" Valerie, Dan's wife, asked in a low voice. They both looked exhausted and unkempt, as if they had been stranded on an island for weeks and had just been rescued. They seemed indifferent to their surroundings. We were calm at that moment, but there was tension in the air. "No thanks," I declined the offer, not feeling comfortable accepting anything from them yet. "Tell me, just to get us started, what are your children's names and how old are they?" I already had this information, but I wanted to see how they both reacted to the questions. Valerie replied, "Well, Damien is 17 years old. He dropped out of school last week, but he's not here today. And here is my dear Kelsey. She is 11 years old. He's with his grandmother for the weekend. Today is Wednesday, ma'am." "Ah, right. Sorry, she is with her aunt. I lost track of time since she's never here, but she will be coming home soon." Her husband stared at her, almost without looking directly at her. It was more like he was looking through her. I took note of that. "I'm sorry, but remember, this interview is being recorded. I apologize if I am mistaken, but I have noted here that you have a 3rd child." They both looked me coldly in the eyes. A shiver ran down my spine, and my left leg went numb. It was a feeling I had when I was a child if I ever made a joke that offended someone, but now, at 34, I suddenly felt out of place. "Jessica," they spoke in unison. I relaxed a little. "Jessica, okay, I have this here. 7 years?" They nodded together. Their faces contorted into an uncomfortable expression, both of them suddenly starting to wring their hands. Dan glanced at the stairs to his left, I think silently signaling where Jessica was. "She's upstairs," Valerie said, suddenly sobbing. A pain hit my heart like a punch. I could feel my emotions building up around my ribs. My stomach started to turn. Great, can I meet her? I asked, trying to maintain my composure. Yes, but Valerie wiped her nose with a tissue and looked up at the stairs. But you're going to have to go get her. Another strange feeling came over me. I was starting to get suspicious, but I still wasn't sure why. Those two looked like a mess, and it was my job to judge the situation. However, they didn't seem like bad people, but rather victims. I decided to accept the request. Okay, where is she up there in her room? I scratched the back of my head as I usually do when I'm uncomfortable. Yes. They both responded at the same time again. I stared at the two of them for a while before getting up and heading towards the stairs. Boom! My heart when my foot slid something metal across the floor. I looked down and saw an empty food bowl. Don't worry, I'm sorry about that. Dan picked up the bowl from the floor. That's our cat Evie's bowl. I nodded but didn't respond. I just went up the stairs to the top floor. The creaking of the steps was eerie and loud as I ascended into a dark, dimly lit hallway. I couldn't form any clear thoughts. There was something strange going on there, but I still didn't know what it was. Why did they send me to get their daughter? Why weren't they? Why did I accept the request? As I checked the long hallway, I noticed a door at the end. It was decorated with stickers and letters, looking like a normal girl's room. The letters spelled out the name Jessica, except the S next to the E was missing. I also noticed that there didn't seem to be any light coming from inside the room. I was mentally writing everything down for my report. I chose to knock on the door out of respect, but I got no response. After 3 or 4 tries, I decided to just open the door, figuring they had been mistaken about which room it was in. The door slowly creaked open under the grip of my left hand. My other hand held my clipboard, perhaps tighter than it should have. Just as I expected, the room was dark. Only a small amount of moonlight came in through the window, illuminating the space dimly. I found the switch on the wall to my right and turned it on. Get out, shit! My heart skipped a beat as what I saw in the center of the room was completely unexpected. I entered the room, and when I turned on the light, I saw a little girl with dark brown hair sitting cross-legged on the bed, smiling at me. I hadn't noticed it before with the lights off. The scare was immediate, but I was paralyzed. Sorry, Jessica, I didn't think there was anyone here. Hey, she said, still with that smile on her face. Hi, I'm here talking to your parents, and they told me you'd be up here. I just need to ask a few questions. How are you, Jessica? Is this like a game? She asked, maintaining the smile that now seemed a little strange to me. What once seemed like a happy smile suddenly took on an unsettling tone. I couldn't explain what I was feeling, but the nervousness started to grow again. Not exactly, but it'll just take a moment. She continued to look at me with that eccentric smile that didn't change. I walked over to the dresser in front of her bed and picked up my pen. Jessica, how are you feeling today? Hungry. I blinked a few times, trying to process. Hungry, huh? Okay, haven't you had dinner yet? It's pretty late now. They ate dinner, but I fed myself. I blinked again, confused. They don't feed you? It's okay, I can eat whenever I want. The smile on her face sent a shiver down my spine, much colder than the air outside. I cleared my throat, trying to maintain my composure. Do you like your parents? I asked. Geez, I used to. She lowered her head slightly, looking at me with her neck tilted, but keeping the same smile. Jessica, I need to understand what's going on here so I can help you, okay? If you're honest, I can do it. She nodded without taking her eyes off me. Where are your brother and sister today? She didn't respond. I noticed that the house cat jumped onto the bed and lay down near the post, watching Jessica intently. The kitten, do you like your cat? Jessica smiled even more widely now, and her eyes gleamed with a disturbing mischief. Then she tilted her head to the side and spoke, but not in her own voice. This voice was deeper and graver. I am hungry. It was then that she grabbed the cat from the bed and pulled its neck to her mouth. She crushed him, and the poor thing began to hiss and scream in pain. I gasped and backed away, falling against the dresser. Jessica tilted her head back and let out the most maniacal laugh I'd ever heard in my life, while blood dripped from his teeth and lips. She grabbed the cat with both hands now, and the blood gushed onto the bed. Then I heard a pop, and everything went silent. Jessica fell onto her stomach and continued to bite her fur and meat of the cat. I could hear his lips and teeth clicking and grinding. That's when I threw up on the floor. I think I vomited 2 or 3 times before I ran towards the door, colliding with the opposite wall outside. I stumbled and stomped back downstairs where Dan and Valerie were still sitting. They both just looked at me, as if they knew exactly what I had just witnessed and why they were acting so strangely. I stared at the two of them, without either of us saying a word for a long time. Finally, as I started toward the door, Valerie spoke. Wait, she exclaimed. I turned around, hand still on the front door handle, fear still present in my watery eyes. Valerie looked at me with the saddest eyes. holding her husband's arm tightly, and said, "Aren't you going to help us?" I'm sure I saw something crawling. I was at home alone watching TV on a Saturday night, dressed in my favorite pajamas and lazily leaning back in my armchair. I've never been one to do anything exciting, so as I flipped through the channels, I wondered if I should find something interesting or just let sleep take me. Nothing seemed to hold my attention. A British soap opera, a Wimbledon match, some news about the opening of a new wildlife study center. So I decided to watch a horror movie. Without really caring what it was, I just wanted something to pass the time until I dozed off. I've never been a man who is easily frightened. Horror films were repetitive. Haunted houses seemed like just a joke to me, and ghosts or aliens were, in my opinion, pure nonsense. However, there was one thing that truly terrified me: spiders. The way they moved with those thin legs and the fact that some of them were poisonous left me completely disconcerted. I didn't mind fake spiders in horror movies or attractions, but real spiders? I couldn't bear to be in the same room as one of them. This is why a good portion of my salary went towards insecticides, ensuring that my home was not hospitable to these unwanted visitors. Still, I always feared that one might sneak in, leaving a trail of disease and poison with its hairy, twitching appendages. That night, as the horror movie was halfway through, my eyes began to feel heavy, and I decided to get out of my chair and go to bed. As I planted my feet on the ground, I felt a sharp sting in my left foot. "There!" I screamed loudly. I lifted my foot and, looking down, let out an even louder scream at what I saw. It was a spider, not too big, maybe the size of my palm, but scary enough. Its slender legs were dark brown, but its back displayed a bizarre mix of red, yellow, and blue, as if someone had randomly spilled paint on it. I looked at my foot and saw that a small red welt had formed on the side. When I looked at the spider again, I saw that it was running away. Terrified that the spider was hiding somewhere else in my house, I grabbed one of my slippers and threw it at it. I hit home, breaking some of his legs and flattening his body. The crumpled remains of the spider still moved in a bizarre and desperate manner. I took advantage of the opportunity and, with the slipper in my hand, hit her until she stopped moving. With the adrenaline fading, I looked at the crushed remains of the spider, now nothing more than a mass of spindly legs, some of which were glued to the sole of my flip-flop. Well, I'll never wear that again, I thought, as I got rid of the cursed slipper. I grabbed some paper napkins and started cleaning the spider's corpse. Honestly, that was the worst part. Live spiders were scary, but the dead were disgusting. I went to the bathroom, walking like Frankenstein, desperate to wash my hands twice. When I finished, still disgusted, I went back to the room and saw that the movie was still playing. I rearranged some books that had fallen and bent down to pick up the remote control, but instead of feeling rubber buttons and plastic, I felt something smooth and trembling, something moving in my fingers. I looked down and saw another spider, which had crawled up the remote control and was now crawling up my arm. I screamed, shaking the spider away. When it fell to the ground, I noticed that it looked a lot like the previous spider. In fact, I was willing to bet it was the same species. Before he could escape, I grabbed my second slipper and slapped it again until I killed her again. So I threw the slipper away again and went to wash my hands again. I grabbed more paper napkins and went back into the living room to clean up the mess. But to my surprise, there was no trace of the spider dead. I looked for the body, but found nothing. Maybe it's gone with the wind, I muttered to myself. Or maybe she's not dead. Maybe I'm still at your house, whispered a voice in the back of my mind. I chose to ignore that theory and decided to call it a night, too tired for anything else. I went back to the bathroom for the last time to brush my teeth. I yawned loudly as I squeezed the paste onto the toothbrush and put it in my mouth. But suddenly my tiredness was replaced by intense panic. There was something in my mouth besides the toothbrush, something that moved, something alive. I spat quickly and with horror saw the creature in the sink. It was a spider, the same spider, with the same red, yellow, and blue markings, now dead by the impact on the sink. How did it end up in my mouth? How was this possible? As my mind spun, trying to find explanations for the unexplainable, but each thought only left me more confused. She must have crawled on my toothbrush while I wasn't looking. And I, without realizing it, put the toothbrush in my mouth. Yes, that makes sense, I thought to myself. Of course, realizing that I had already seen the same spider 3 times that night only added to my fears. Is it an infestation? It's an infestation, I thought, feeling a rising panic. Oh no, please no, anything but that. Suddenly I felt dizzy and ran to the mirror cabinet where I kept some anxiety medication. I always had some on hand just in case. I took the medicine and closed the cupboard. looking in the mirror to see if I looked as bad as I felt. And then, there it was again, the same spider, crawling just below my left ear. Desperately, I slapped her face, trying to push her away. I closed my eyes, too terrified to look at the creature. Even without seeing her, I could still feel her crawling all over my face, her filthy legs covering every inch of my skin. It was as if she was not just on my skin, but also inside it. I felt it crawling under my skin, inside every vessel, sanguine, every bone, every fiber of my being. It was disgusting, scary. In this struggle, I stumbled backwards and fell to the ground. Suddenly, the sensation of movement ceased. I quickly got up and ran out of the bathroom as fast as I could. None of this was making sense. There had to be an explanation. This can't be happening. This can't be happening. This can't be happening, I screamed at the top of my lungs. I ran into the living room, trying to escape the purgatory my house had become. I was about to cross the room and jump out the door, but something on the floor stopped me in horror. There were several, maybe dozens, maybe hundreds. The same spiders with the same brown legs and the same bizarre coloring of red, yellow, and blue. They were all over the floor, crawling on my chair, on my books, inside my shoes, and on the coat rack. At that moment, fear gave way to intense anger. That was my floor, my chair, my books, my shoes, my house. These disgusting, disgusting creatures were invading my property. No, I was tired of being afraid. Terror gave way to seething, destructive rage. I ran towards the arachnid nest and started crushing them all with my bare feet. The trauma of that night's events turned into vengeful rage and an uncontrollable desire for revenge. I stepped on each one, no longer caring about the mess, the germs, or the broken appendages. I shook the spiders out of one of my books and used it to crush the ones that were nestled in my armchair. I continued the eight-legged creatures until I was satisfied that they were all dead. Exhausted, I sat in a corner of the room away from the spider carcasses, trying to process what had just happened. But before I could think too much, I heard something knocking on the door. What now? I thought tiredly. The knocking got louder and stronger. I felt a growing fear, a feeling that I needed to run away, that something terrible was coming. Before I could react, the entire front of my house was destroyed, and the cause of the destruction entered. The monster I would never forget. It was a spider, but now it was colossal, easily 4 times bigger than me. Her legs were thick and hairy. Every movement made my house shake. The giant effortlessly destroyed a room in my house and continued to destroy more with each step. I could clearly see its face with 8 black eyes and 2 jaws snapping menacingly, with foul-smelling green goo dripping from its mouth, burning holes in the ground. I tried to run, but the spider jumped forward, destroying the roof and trapping me with one of its legs. I couldn't move. I felt my ribs almost cracking under the pressure. No, please stop, I begged. The spider moved its terrifying jaws closer while keeping me trapped. No, please stop, someone help me. She slowly advanced, preparing to bite me. When it attacked, I let out one last scream. Breathe! Breathe, Mr. Miller, you're okay, you're safe. I opened my eyes. I saw a man in his 40s, wearing a white coat. He placed his hand on my left shoulder and looked at me with concern. I looked around. I was in a hospital, in a bed, with my arm connected to an IV and dressed in a patient gown. Don't worry, Mr. Miller, there is no more danger, said the man who was apparently a doctor. Noticing my confusion, he continued, You were having a panic attack in your sleep. Luckily, I came to check on you. You had an intense experience, to say the least. All I could say was a confused, what? Let me explain. Last night, your neighbors heard your screams and called the police. It appears you were bitten by one of the poisonous spiders that escaped from the nearby Wildlife Study Center. We found it crawling on your face. I remembered how I had been bitten on my toe and looked down, noticing that the red welt had turned into an ugly rash. But I saw a giant spider, I muttered, still stunned. Oh yes. Well, the species that bit you is known for causing wild hallucinations. From your screams, I'd say you saw some nightmarish things, the doctor explained. You have no idea, I sighed. I tried to get up but found I couldn't. I looked at the doctor, confused. This spider's bite also causes temporary paralysis, so you won't be able to get up for a few hours. But the medicine I gave you will soon take effect and you will feel much better. The doctor gave me a reassuring smile. I'll ask one of the nurses to take care of you, he said, leaving the room. I nodded, realizing I could still move my head. And then I started laughing quite loudly, actually. It was all just a dream, a nightmare, a hallucination. I silently thanked the heavens that none of it was real. Now it was just a matter of waiting until I could walk again. I swear I will never go near another spider again. Thank God it's over. I started to feel thirsty and turned my head to see if the nurse was coming yet, when I noticed something crawling on the side of the bed. A miserable little thing with thin, dark brown legs and a random mix of red, yellow, and blue on its back. It was a spider, the same spider, and she was crawling right towards me.